And this is meant to be much more of an interactive session. I have myself, Isa, and Chris, who presented a couple of sessions ago about, preparing your plot for gardening. So we're going to both share some images of where our gardens are right now. And then we did get some questions in advance, a lot about pest control and that type of thing. So we'll go into that a little bit. But if you have any questions as we're going through this, there's not many slides. I just wanted a little something to ground us. Feel free to speak up. Since I'm presenting, I can't always see the chat box. So feel free to just chime in. I think we have about I don't know, about 40 people who signed up today. So it shouldn't be overly difficult to have your voice heard. So thank you again for coming. So I just start out here. Wanted to start with, what's new for me this year, and maybe some of you can relate to that. Last year, I planted a lovely in-ground garden. It was my fourth year planting on this spot that I had converted from a lawn to a garden. And, I'd just gotten it to the point where the soil was built up and it was full of worms and all sorts of beneficial critters. And then last year, a goat covered my garden in around the end of May and ate everything. So, so this year is new soil for me because I ended up building raised beds, leveled out the ground a lot. Really sad to lose that healthy soil underneath, but sometimes you just got to deal with critters. So put the hardware cloth down in March, built the raised beds above it, and then after that, also in March, so I don't have to use so much soil because one, it's expensive, obviously. But two, you can really do a lot with straw bales. I don't know how many of you have tried or have heard of straw bale gardening before, but I took that approach in March, and it takes about 6 weeks to condition the straw, and then it I guess I never turned on my camera. And so it essentially starts to decompose the straw. So it will be a good base for, ongoing soil as the years go on. So that is why that was done in March. About 6 weeks later in May, I added about 1,400 pounds of organic soil from Pico. If you're not familiar with Pico, I know it's been mentioned before. They're down in Big Arm, but they really have, I find, some of the best quality soil, and they do sell those big 700-pound bags of soil. So I got 2 of those for this particular project and just topped off the straw that had been conditioned so that, the plants would have a nice start. And underneath, between the straw and the soil, I put compost, my own compost that I let compost over the winter. So it also has those nutrients in the soil. So that's where I was in May. I ended up planting my first plantings at the end of May, May 25th. So on the left-hand side, you can see where we were on May 25th. The squash plants are in the foreground, and the tomatoes that you may be able to see somewhat in the background. They looked like they were about to die when I first planted them. They weren't doing well at all. But after I planted those, I also, you'll notice on the left-hand side, tiny little green dots, that's crimson clover that I seeded as a cover crop. And just want to show you a little bit of the difference. So by, mid-June, a couple of days ago, I took these pictures on the right. And I have on the next slide a more close-up. But you can see that the crimson clover is starting to come off. There are some bare spots where the birds ate the seed. But hey, we're there to share. I like the birds too. They're very cute, but it's all good. But going to where we are today, you can see, if you look at the crimson clover and some of the squash plants in that upper middle image, see how that's thriving. And one of the things I know that a presenter mentioned in previous session was, how important it is to have green mulch or cover crops. And here you can see a really big difference between that slide before, where these plants are pretty, sickly looking, and upper upper middle picture, and really just a couple of weeks later, almost 3 weeks later, where the cover crop has grown, the squash is really thriving. I think part of that is because, it's just had a chance to root itself, and, all transplants, when you first transplant them, have a little bit of a recovery period, so that's nothing unusual. But also the clover is nitrogen fixing. The squash is a very heavy feeder and likes to have that extra nitrogen to thrive. So it's a symbiotic relationship between the two. And just, as we go on later on in the season, the crimson clover will grow to be several feet tall and start to flower. The benefits early in the season is it's nitrogen fixing. It provides some cover so weeds don't grow. But when it gets really tall, I pull it up. The roots are pretty straight, so they don't disturb the other plants very much. And I just pull it straight up before it goes to seed, chop it, and then remulch it over the top. So it'll decompose, but you want to get it before it goes to seed, unless you just want to, have it reseed itself and compete for other space in your garden. So that's what that is. And then you can see the various plants where they are today. I've got peas coming up in the upper left. I've got tomatillos in the upper right. Different types of squash and potatoes in the tomatoes rather in the lower right. Peppers and some eggplant in the bottom middle. And then the left is just the tomatillo, more of a close-up. So that's where we are today. All these are, all the ones that I have pictures of here were planted from transplants. I did direct seed some chard, some Brussels sprouts, and I don't have pictures, I don't think, in any of these. But those are, a few inches tall at this point and are starting to come up. And I just planted those relatively recently. So that's what we're looking at right now. I anticipate, over the next couple of years, I'll continue to compost and mulch. And depending on what kind of worms I attract, if I don't feel like I'm attracting enough, I may, prime the pump with some purchased worms. Because I just find they do such a great job in keeping all the soil aerated and, getting healthy waste into the soil. So even though, the garden doesn't look too bad now, I anticipate over the next couple of years that it will actually be back to where it was when it was in ground before my gophers got to it. So that's where we are today. I wanted to talk a little bit about, my approach, and this is just my approach to dealing with critters because it was such a hot topic from the emails. And it may be controversial, but hear me out. So my approach is really to think about the garden as, if we're attracting critters, even the gophers, it's a good thing. That means your garden is alive and creating a desirable habitat for living things. So I don't, rather than start with the attitude of, oh, I can't believe these cabbage moths are eating all my cabbage, start with, hey, they like something about my garden. They found their way, to my garden. How do you actually deal with them if you want to have some cabbage left by the end of the season? But again, I start with, which critters are actually there, and then trying to understand what it is they like about your garden. So I know a lot of the questions were really specific to specific types of, invaders. Like earwigs and ants and slugs and that type of thing. And there are plenty of tips if you want to think about dealing with specific critters, but I thought it would be good to start with at least my perspective, and Chris will share her perspective as well, and I'm not sure we have exactly the same. We'll find out. but that's really what I want to start with, is like, if you know what your pests like about your garden, you have a few opportunities. You can plant a complementary companion plant they like better. So for instance, I always plant nasturtium by my tomatoes because, one, they're beautiful, but also they can attract aphids away from tomatoes. I haven't really had a problem with aphids, but I just, I find that they will, inhabit the nasturtium. And then, the other way of dealing with it, once you know what they like, is attracting predators for them so that are beneficial. So for instance, if you have earwigs that are eating all your young plants, then you may want to, plant calendula, and that attracts a fly that eats earwigs. There are lots of examples of those types of things where you can use companion planting to not be fighting your pests, but looking at what it is they like about your garden, seeing if you can find something to plant that they like better. And then, sometimes there's synergies between pests. So if you have both ants and aphids, well, ants eat aphids. So, there's a certain point where the ants will, maybe overtake and start eating your young plants. You don't want that, but it's helpful to at least start with thinking about, what does your ecosystem look like in your garden? What is actually there? What are you planting? What do the pests like about your garden? And then you can start to think about, how do you manage it in a complementary, working with nature as opposed to trying to fight nature. So that really brings to the second point, looking at, and no pun intended, solving root causes, rather than just trying to treat the immediate problem. What is the root cause? And I think, one of the root causes in a garden that's attracting pests is you've got a good garden, and that's a good thing. And so figure out how to work with that as opposed to against it. Third thing, keeping your plants as healthy as possible. And this goes into healthy soil and some of what I was just talking about, planting green mulch so that you really have robust, strong plants. So even if you have to sacrifice a few, I know a few years ago I had a bad problem with cabbage moths, and I use a little, you can make a little moth kind of decoy, and it tracks them away. There are lots of things you can do. But in the end, I was like, okay, well, let's just see what they do this year. And they did. They got their fill on a couple of cabbage, and then they left the rest alone. And those did fine. They all had a little bit of damage, but they were able to overcome that. And I think that if you have to prioritize, keeping your plants healthy is going to make them more resilient over time, as long as they're not being totally wiped out before they even get a start. So there's no exact science with this, but it's more an approach of thinking about, how do all these pieces of your garden work together, and how do you create a healthy ecosystem in that spot so that you don't have to be killing pests all the time, or worrying about what's going to eat your plants next. Over time, hopefully you can learn. And I know some of you are probably more experienced gardeners and may have, already taken this approach. But, over time, you kind of learn what works in your specific area in your garden, what keeps your plants healthy, what kind of pests are you dealing with, and if they are of any benefit or if they're not, just really paying attention to that ecosystem. However, all that said, that's a good place to start. But sometimes, your garden will just be overrun. Fortunately, it hasn't happened to me here yet. I'm in year 6, but again, these are new beds, so we'll see. Um, but the only thing that's really overrun my garden has been the gophers last year. I really haven't had a lot of problem in my particular area with devastating pests. Could happen tomorrow, you just never know. Um, but the fact is that most folks who have gardened for a while will eventually run up against some kind of a pest that is going to destroy your plants before they get a chance to get themselves healthy and and be able to resist an attack. So if you have to intervene directly, use physical intervention. So, if you've got deer, fence them out. If you've got gophers, you can put hardware cloth underneath raised beds. If you have moths, you can use a floating row cover over your garden as a physical barrier. You can, if you have aphids that are gathering on the underside of your tomato plants and they seem like they're getting a good foothold, blast them off with a little water. They're pretty, as long as they're young, then, they should be able to blast them off. Or, pay attention to your garden if you notice that you're just starting to see little worms or larvae or something else that looks like it's going to eat your plant. Pick them off by hand. A lot of times just catching them early and getting rid of them physically will stop the problem. And you can always compost those dead insects. You can also trap them, that's, for like slugs. You can put a little bit of, I know beer is really popular to attract them, and in a little can, and then you can dump that elsewhere. For earwigs, you can put a little oil in the bottom of a can, and earwigs will be attracted to, especially if it's like a fish oil or some smell that they really like. So there are lots of, ideas for trapping, barriers, and physical intervention that you can do without resorting to the so-called non-toxic, natural, organic methods of pest control. I use these. I've never used these, frankly. I kind of have, like I said, taken the approach of, will, try to do companion planting, try to use physical intervention, getting my plants healthy. Doesn't mean that at some point I won't have to. I just haven't run across something I couldn't solve without the first 4 steps. But if you have to use some sort of chemical intervention, there's, sometimes that's all it's going to work. I know neem oil in sort of a water and a Castile stove base is supposed to be good for aphids, cabbage moths. There's BT, which is a natural occurring bacterial, is a spray or powder that'll kill larvae. Diatomaceous earth will disrupt the guts of earwigs and that sort of thing. Pyrethrum, which is, derived from a type of daisy that's a poison that will be toxic to wasps if you have a problem with wasps. Although, anything in the wasp family is also going to be killed, so that's going to be toxic to your honeybees and then your amphibians. So all of these are, used as sort of a last resort, I think are pretty good. And I don't know if you can, someone has their line open, it's reverberating. So if you can just put yourself on mute until you have a question, be great. But if you must use some sort of chemical intervention, my approach is really use it as a last resort, use it very sparingly, and recognize what the side effects are. But again, going back to, knowing why the critters like what's in your garden, solving for those root causes, keeping your plants as healthy as possible, and using physical intervention should get you a lot of the way there to a healthy garden. So I'm going to stop there for a second because I know I've kind of been going from the fire hose here. Did anybody have any questions or thoughts? And if you can just speak up, you know, unmute yourself and speak up. All right, well, let me ask you, so are you, is anybody having any problems with their gardens at this early stage that you have questions about, or haven't you started a garden yet? All right, well,
Hello?
yes, please go ahead.
Hello? I'm having some trouble with my pea seedlings and cucumber starts. Everything else is doing really good in raised beds, but they're seeming kind of peakish, like they may not make it.
How long ago did you plant? Did you plant them, the peas, I assume you plant direct, or did you plant them from starts?
From start.
Okay.
Do you want to take a,
Yeah, I'm gonna pass you to Chris because I've got a barky dog. I'm gonna deal with.
if you planted little starts, sometimes that's a tricky process. And if they dry out, it can, you know, set them back. That
I never let them get dry. They for sure didn't dry out.
okay. Yeah, it's hard not knowing what the soil condition is. If they didn't dry out, that's good. Sometimes if it gets too yellow, that could mean the soil's too wet. I don't know.
Oh, they are yellowy.
Uh-huh.
They are yellowy.
Yeah.
So what's that mean?
It could mean that the soil's too wet, that the roots, you know, are just kind of overwhelmed. So that.
Do you think do you think I could dig them back out so that they could dry out a little bit? Would they stand a chance if they're yellow still to maybe survive if I did that?
I don't know that I probably wouldn't do that. It's interesting to try to figure out why something isn't healthy. If they're looking really yellow, you know what? I would just be tempted to start over. I would be tempted to get some fresh seed and just re-sow the seed. And then go ahead and compost the little plants that have, you know, yellowed. And if your cucumber isn't looking good, I'd kind of be tempted to try to do the same thing. We haven't had real warm weather yet, so you could easily start cucumber now from seed, and you'd still get a good harvest. There's still plenty of time.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Appreciate that.
Sure. Are there anybody else have a question, or I can just say a few things about, you know, a few things I've experienced with the past. I know with aphids, sometimes if plants are growing really quickly or you've got too much nitrogen, that can attract aphids. And I'm with Pamela. I don't really want to use any interventions. In the past, would use safer soap or I'd use neem oil, but once your plant is, you know, it's stressed, it's almost, I think, better to just let it try to overcome on its own, or to go ahead and just pull it out and start over. I think sometimes, and sometimes what you'll see is like you'll have a row of peas, and maybe they're just a couple plants that are infested with the aphids. You know, just take those out. Sometimes if plantings are too congested and there isn't good airflow, that encourage pest problems. And then another thing I've learned is just a lot of the brassicas, the things like the broccolis and the cabbage, as the plants get older, the lower leaves are going to kind of start just, you know, giving up the ghost. They won't have the energy, and that's where you're going to sometimes find the pests. So I often will just clean up, take the lower leaves off, compost them. And if you start doing that, look first, that often that's where you're going to see the pests. They're going to be either at the tip or on the lower, older leaves. And then the earwigs, you can just like, they do, I hate earwigs. They're icky. You can take newspaper and wet it and roll it up and leave it in the garden overnight. And in the morning, the earwigs are going to be in the newspaper, and then you can just toss it, you know, far in a corner of your property if you want, or, you know, or just, you know, in the garbage. The ants, ants are interesting. They like it dry. They like dry soil, and they can damage plants. A neighbor just told me that you can use grits. If you sprinkle the grits where the ants are, the workers will take the grits to the queen and it kills her. But then, yeah, that's just like you're wiping out the ants, as Pamela mentioned. I mean, they actually are predators too. So they will take care of some of the caterpillars, and they also will
They
clean
love
up.
aphids.
Yeah, and they even clean up some of the plant material.
What about whitefly?
Whitefly, wow, that was a tough one too.
Every year, my Virginia creeper is covered in whitefly, and by probably mid-August, all of the leaves are gone, and I miss all that, you know, the beauty of Virginia creeper in September.
Yeah. Some plants, it's interesting. You have a rose bush that's beautiful and it's vigorous, but every spring, right now, it's growing really fast, and it has whitefly on all the older leaves. So what I end up doing is pretty much defoliating it to get rid of the whitefly, and then it kind of pushes new growth and regrows, and it's not an issue later in the season. But there's this little window right when it's budded up right now, and it looks beautiful, and then I start going, wait a minute, what are those spots on those leaves? And you look underneath and it's whitefly. So
Yeah.
my solution is just to and that's like, the plant is so congested, there isn't good airflow. So each year I've tried to be more conscious of pruning it a little better so that there are more open spaces. But yeah, whitefly is a tough one, and its companion, supposedly cilantro, is a good companion that the whitefly doesn't like to be around. So, and that I keep forgetting to plant the cilantro with my rose. So,
Thank you.
yeah.
Any other questions? You don't have to think of them all right now.
Yeah.
You can ask at any time.
Yeah.
Thanks. So speaking of companion planting, I put this in for the sake of the presentation online. We've talked a lot about, you know, why companion plants are so good. These are my nasturtiums from a couple of years ago with cherry tomatoes, and they just thrive together. I also included in this the companion planting chart. So if you, I don't know if the whitefly was, yeah, whitefly likes nasturtium or basil as a spray. So that's what they suggest here. But this is kind of a nice little chart that will be online afterwards. If you have specific questions about, you know, particular pests in your garden, and then, you know, some suggestions for what might work to attract them away from your plants. But I know it's not something you can read in this little tiny form, but it will be online afterwards.
Do you mind repeating what you said about the ants?
You can use grits, you know, the corn.
Oh, okay.
You can use that. And supposedly they will take it to the queen and it kills the queen. And then boric acid is supposed to be a way to control them. I did try boric acid when I lived in Colorado because the ants were pretty bad in that dry soil. And it didn't work. So, yeah, the ants, it's so interesting. create the formic acid, and evidently the formic acid is really beneficial in the garden. So it's, what are we willing to tolerate? You know, it's an interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, it's again, just I think working with as much as possible. And there may be some types of vegetables or other types of plants in your area that will continually attract pests. Nothing you can do is going to, short of continually spraying, is going to get rid of them. So maybe that's the varietal that you get at the farmer's market, and stick with what goes well in your garden. I think it's the same for deer. I've been in several year experience of like what's working for my deer, not to be eaten like in the like a little fire pit area with flowers around it, and it's just constantly trying new things, replacing it, and all your list of deer resistant plants. Some of them they love, like coreopsis, they absolutely love it. So I can't have coreopsis for my deer, but they hate yarrow, they hate all the sages, salvias, they hate
Lavender,
those.
yeah.
They hate lavender. They're not a big fan of rosemary, oregano, anything that's sort of in the mint family or kind of strong smelling. But that's just my deer. Other places, I've heard from other folks that have their deer eat all the yarrow. So I think it's a lot of what works well in your area, and it's a bit of trial and error. But again, just paying attention to the whole ecosystem, and not just what's in your garden, but the larger ecosystem too is helpful. This is just a little shot of what the crimson clover looks like. Just before I pull it up, you can see it's quite tall. This is from a couple of years ago. You have to, you can start pulling if it's really shading your vegetables, but I found that, by the time it gets to be this height, most of the plants that are thriving have already gotten to the size where they're not going to be interfered with by the clover. So, but pull it up anytime is fine. Like I said, they have straight roots, so it's, you would think it would really disrupt the soil, but that has not been my experience. It just provides a little extra aeration. And by that time, you have enough cover crop with all your other vegetables that are growing too. So that's that. Just a couple of things I added in these. Again, you can look at these at your leisure. The virtuous circle of healthy soil. Once you kind of figure out what works to create healthy soil in your area, it's just going to be a virtuous circle that continues to build upon itself until you have to dismantle it and start fresh with new raised beds like I did this year. But we'll get back to healthier soil over time. And then just some components to keep in mind, which will be in that presentation. So that's kind of what, that's my little virtual tour for this time of year. There aren't, plants are still really young. I've direct seeded some chard that's just starting to come up. And like I said, the Brussels sprouts are starting to come up. The ones that I started in the hothouse, all the tomatoes, tomatillos, eggplants. The eggplants I planted in the main res beds look like they're fixing to die. The ones I planted in the containers are looking great. So, not surprisingly, they like warmer soil, and the soil tends to stay warmer in the container. But I continue to try new things every year and just see, what works in my area and what doesn't. So any other questions before I hand it over to Chris? Chris has some slides as well to share from her garden. All right.
I'll just say one other thing about the ant question. I'm just thinking, ants really like dry soil, and if you'll notice sometimes if you have a really heavy rain, the ants will pull the eggs out of their nest. So one thing you could do is maybe just try to wet that soil to discourage the ants so they move.
Just give me a second. I'm just loading Chris's presentation here. Is it going to let me share? Yes. All right. You just can press any of these down or across to change the.
Okay. So these are just some pictures of my garden, you know, this past week, basically, to show you, you know, what the growth is. And then I'll just talk about a few things that I've been doing. So early May, I spend a lot of time just edging around all these raised beds. And one of the biggest tasks is just keeping the grass from growing into the raised beds. So the cedar bark that you can see by the raised beds, that is actually really effective. And then in the far corner of the picture, that's sawdust that is along the edges from raised beds. And then what I'll do later in the summer is the grass clippings will go on top of the sawdust. And that actually makes it really easy. You still get some weeds coming through, but they're really easy to pull. And then it makes really good soil. The soil on that edge is really good. Okay, and then this just picture the potatoes. And then the process with potatoes is you are supposed to hill them. You mound soil up against the stems as they grow, and that's where the potatoes are going to form. So I've done that 3 times at this point, and then I had some leftover leaves, so put those around them just as a mulch. But I'll probably try to do, I've been cleaning out the compost bins. I still have a nice amount of compost. I think I'm going to use some of that compost to do another hilling up. And then this is a picture of a parsnip plant that overwintered, and it's a little hard to see, but it's starting to flower. It's a little bit of yellow at the top. I'm going to let it go to seed. Parsnip's actually a pretty healthy plant. It's a good winter plant. It's good roasted. It's good in soups and stews. It's like survival food. We might need to survive.
It's huge.
Yeah, and it's a pretty plant. Okay, and this is the garlic that is looking really good this year. And I, in mid-April, planted some beet seeds in between the garlic. And so the garlic will be harvested in another month. And then the beets can continue to grow. And it's just a way of trying to figure out how to utilize the space so that it's not ever really empty. And then this is just a shot of showing the grass clippings that can be used as just a mulch in the garden. It's interesting, they dry out pretty quickly. And it's like when you compost, there's the idea if you use the brown material and then you put the green on top. So if you do a layer of grass clippings and then, you know, a couple of weeks later come and do another layer, you're putting the fresh green on top of the brown. And what it found is when you do that, it really loosens up the soil underneath and it retains moisture. It's really good at keeping the moisture in. And then this is just a shot of an edge of a bed. And this is just, I have planted things like calendula, borage, sunflowers, alyssum, cilantro. Buckwheat is a wonderful plant that attracts beneficial insects. And then if you could figure out how to do it, you can save the seed and make buckwheat pancakes. I just haven't figured out how to clean them efficiently. But once you have these plants, you generally they're going to drop some seed and you're going to have them in your garden for a long time. So I've been gardening for 6 seasons at this house. And none of this along this edge was planted. That just all came in. You know, the birds dropped the seed. And what I've been doing lately is where I want to plant, I just start removing and composting as I need that space for other things. And then this is just a shot. We had that cold spell where it dropped into the 30s. And I had planted the tomatoes, so I ran out and put some leaf bags on the tomato cages, just as a, and then the next day, it was still kind of cool, and I thought, maybe I should just leave the bags on. And then I thought, no, they need whatever light they're getting. So I took them off, and then it hailed.
Oh, no.
I thought I should have left them on. And then this is a shot of onions. And the bed on the right, that was transplanted in late April. And then I ran out of energy and I just didn't get around to finishing the rest of the onions. And so the bed on the left was like mid-May when those were put in. Onions are really good at just kind of hanging out for a while, and it doesn't set them back too much. And then I like this idea. It's a staggered harvest. I won't have to do it all at once. And then this is just a little bit of a slope at the end of the bed that I had sown arugula seed really thickly. And that is such a good way to do arugula, because you can just take the scissors and you can cut it, 3 or 4 times, and then you just kind of let it go. It's starting to stretch into flower. And then the mustard plant on the left is a volunteer. And then behind it, it's a little hard to see, but that's a Phycelia, which is a really good bee plant. It attracts the honeybees. So I like to have a lot of flowering plants for the bees in the garden to attract them. And then this is cilantro that was seeded really thickly. And it's the same thing. You can cut it maybe 3 times before it starts to flower. Today I cooked some rice and I took a big handful of the cilantro and chopped it up and just mixed it in with the rice. And that's just really a good way to use it. And this is comfrey, which is it's a dramatic plant. This plant's probably like 4 feet tall, but it's a good companion for fruit trees. It attracts the bumblebees, and then it grows really vigorously. You could cut this 3 times during the season and use it for compost. And then you could also make a compost tea with it to feed your plants. Or I sprained my ankle last summer. You can actually make a really nice compress. You just kind of steep the leaves in boiling water and then soak it in a cloth. And it dramatically helps with sprains. And then these are salad greens that have been going pretty strong since the 1st of May. And I've just been cutting the outer leaves, but they grow so quickly this time of year. I'm almost to the point where I need to just get all my neighbors to come over with bags and we'll start harvesting all of it, because we've had the cool weather. The lettuce is still in really good shape and it hasn't started to look like it wants to flower. And then these are some Asian greens and some chard, and they're enjoying the cooler weather too. And the little tatsoi in the foreground, that is starting to flower. I've been cutting the flowering stems and chopping them up and sauteing them for breakfast. They're good, along with all the other greens.
Looks gorgeous.
Yeah. And then this is spinach that it's flowering, and I decided, okay, I'm gonna just let it go to seed and collect the seed. So it's a kind of maybe a 3 by 4 foot area that I thought I can do this. I'm just going to let that go to seed, because I think we really do need to think about saving as much seed from our gardens as possible. For one thing, that seed is going to be adapted to our climate, and who knows what's going to be happening with, you know, the seed companies and just seed availability.
They've been so overwhelmed this year.
Yeah.
Anyway.
And then I have apple trees, and it's like, this is the time you need to thin the apples. It's like, I hate doing this because they, you go, oh, they're all so cute. They're all so, but, you know, you'll have like 5 little apples.
No, I was going to accuse you of doing it.
And so I'll usually just leave 1 or 2 in the bundle. And that way you get a.
Huh?
You got Clorox wipes?
Oh, I wonder.
Hey, there's can
She
you guys
gets a bundle of apple juice like that, and she chops them all out except 1 or 2
Yeah.
to try and make the apples get bigger.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then this next slide is honeyberry, which is actually it's a
Your apple's bigger.
bush. And it's the first fruit
This
to
is free
ripen.
to see online.
They're just right around the stem, and they stay on the plant.
Oh, honeyberry.
You can
I heard about
actually
that.
harvest for a couple months. It's
Wow.
actually pretty interesting. And they're bigger than a blueberry. They're longer. That purple color tells you it's got a lot of good nutrient in it. And I think they're growing these in Canada. They're really cold hardy and it's one of those superfoods.
And this is from the honeysuckle?
It's honeyberry, but it's a lanisterase whole group of honeysuckle.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
I never heard
And
of that.
it's the first thing that flowers in the garden too. It has really pale little yellow flowers.
I might need to hit you up for a cutting.
Oh, the beans are in it.
And then if you have shaded areas and you want to just have something productive, these are alpine strawberries. I started these from seed maybe 4 years ago. And they flower through the summer, they produce fruit through the summer. The fruit is small, but it's really, it's delicious. It has an intense flavor. And usually I just eat it in the garden.
You don't quite make it inside.
No, yeah. And then this bed, the taller plant in the background is Angelica, which is a biennial plant. And that is something you can cut the stems and kind of just, you boil them briefly and you can soak them in honey. And it's a good circulatory herb. It's a good respiratory herb. I'm just thinking in terms of winter food and things to just help stay healthy. And then in the far right corner is a mullein plant. It's a volunteer, and a lot of people consider mullein to be a weed, and it does make a million seeds, and it can go everywhere. This is a volunteer. But the flowers are really useful. You can pick the little yellow flowers and you soak them in oil, and it's a good ear oil. So if you have, you know, children or little grandchildren and they get ear infections, it's just soak a cotton ball with that, and and then mullein can also indicate that you have a soil that's contaminated with heavy metals if the stalk grows in a twisted, distorted way. Usually the stalk is just straight. It's like a candelabra, maybe about 3.5 feet tall. It's a really dramatic plant. And then the strawberry plants this year are looking really good. And one of the things that I have to do every year is just, they throw out 1 million runners. And so I need to remove a bunch of those. Otherwise it's sending all the energy into leaf formation and not the fruit. And then the last idea is just to slow down and take some time to enjoy the garden. Just notice things. There was one morning, usually I take my tea and I go outside and look at everything. And this is a poppy, and overnight the little pod had split, And then I walked back past about a half hour later, and those little coverings were on the ground. And then about 20 minutes later, the flower was open.
Amazing.
It happened so fast. It was actually kind of cool. And I thought, oh, I'm glad I need to take more time. I think we all need to take more time to just slow down and notice the beauty around us. And we're all blessed if we have gardens, because it's probably the best place to be.
I agree. And it feeds right in what you just said. It feeds into really paying attention to your whole environment. When you start to notice that things, a plant is looking like it's yellowing a bit, or, maybe you're just getting a few starter holes. If you're paying attention, you can pick up on that really quickly and then address it sooner rather than later. Since you mentioned herbs, I just wanted to share with you guys, there's this great book that someone recommended to me, and I am now recommending it to you. And essentially, it's like a little encyclopedia. It's called Making Plant Medicine by Rico Keck, C-E-C-H. And it just has an encyclopedia of all these herbs, cross-referenced with what you might want to do with them. And I've just found it really interesting. One, for identifying native growing herbs in my area that I didn't know had any medicinal benefits. But just thought I'd share that with you guys in case you're interested in seeing what you may have either growing in your garden or just out in the wild that you can use for medicines and teas and salt.
Can you repeat the author?
Yeah, so it's R-I-C-H-O is his first name, Rico. Last name is Keck, C-E-C-H, and it's called Making Plant Medicine. I don't know when it was published. It's not that old. I was first published in 2000, then he did a revision in 2016, so it's pretty up to date. But, I think it's a super great resource.
It's actually really fun to use the plants. I have 2 elderberry bushes, and I'm actually sipping elderflower tea from my garden. I've got mint. I usually dry the mint for tea. The calendula flowers, you can dry those and add them to teas. Borage flowers you can dry. The little violas are really good for heart health and circulation. You can dry those.
And we're not giving medical advice here, but just, there are some really great ideas for using what you have on hand, especially if you need it. So we have about 3 minutes left. Does anybody have any burning questions? And again, I haven't been able to check the chat because when I'm presenting, it's hard I'd have to close the window to see the chat. So just speak up, unmute yourself and speak up if you have questions. And if you think of them later, feel free to email them. If I don't know the answer, I think my email address was in your registration confirmation. But if I don't have the answer, I probably can find somebody who does. Yeah. And, we're here to support everybody's success. And either if you're a beginning gardener or if you've been doing it a while but have some tricky problems that you want to get answers to, and you may find that there are more than one answer depending on, your situation, to who I talk to. So feel free to send those along. We also have a few more upcoming sessions. The next one will be on thinking about your garden to preserve the harvest. So Julie Lang is going to present about various ways of preserving the harvest, but also what you can start thinking about now for, either freezing, dehydrating, pickling. Pickling is one of my favorites. My absolute favorite is pickled garlic. I think it just turns the garlic. It turns the garlic this like nutty sweet. And it's delicious. So she'll be covering that next time. And then we have some basics on seed saving, like what you need to think about as you start to get toward the end of the season, letting certain plants bolt and go to seed, and how you harvest those seeds. So we have a session on that coming as well. And if you guys have any other ideas for anything else that you'd like to see, you know, later on in the fall, feel free to send those along as well. But I think that's it for today. Were there any last minute thoughts before we sign off?
You guys are awesome.
Well, thank you for coming.
I know, we had fun.
Yes.
We hope you enjoyed it.
Yeah, just want to thank you two.
Yeah, we're happy